Welcome to the Water Data Podcast. In this episode, it's a pleasure to host Margreet Zwarteveen, Professor of Water Governance at IHE Delft. In this episode, Margreet demythologizes water governance. She challenges the idea that water management is purely a technical engineering or natural science problem and helps us see why it's vital to see water governance as a series of political choices, not just a set of technical or administrative puzzles. Margreet also delves deep into gender, power, and control over water. She helps us see that thinking of water as apolitical can actually be quite problematic. She helps us look at gender, caste, and class and how they shape water control and access to water. Finally, Margreet offers alternative imaginaries of community resilience. How we can pluralize water governance to ensure that diverse perspectives are treated as equal and legitimate forms of expertise alongside more traditional disciplines like hydrogeology and engineering. Let's get started. Welcome to the Water Data Podcast, where we talk about science, stories, and systems that shape our water future. I'm your host, Veena. Every couple of weeks, we'll explore how better data and evidence can lead to better decisions and ultimately better outcomes for people and the planet. So whether you're a researcher, a practitioner, or just curious about how we can manage this precious resource, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Today, I have a special guest, Margreet Zwarteveen. Margreet is internationally recognized for her work on water governance, irrigation, and the politics of natural resources. And she is a professor at IHE Delft, as well as the University of Amsterdam. Margaret's trained both as an engineer, originally an irrigation engineer, and then as a social scientist. Her life's work has really been about the politics of water, how water is accessed, how it's allocated, how it's contested. And really, what makes Margreet really unique is that she works both with as an academic scholar, of course, but she also works with with policymakers as well as with activists and citizen scientists to make sure that some of the academic insights actually translate into creating a more inclusive and just water governance. Margreet, welcome to the Water Data Podcast.
Thank you, Veena. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah. I think I'm the first social scientist to be on the podcast, right?
Oh, you're the second. Actually,
Okay.
we recorded with Trevor Birkenholz
Yeah.
also, but I'm very excited by this because you are also originally an engineer, and you started your career in that way. I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about your origin story before we kind of dive deep into the thick of what I'm calling this episode is bringing back the politics into water.
I was choose to study engineering in Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Why? Because I thought if I study engineering, I can actually do something. Because most people would see me more as a social scientist. They would say, Margreet, you belong to the social sciences. But I thought if I do social scientists, then the only thing I can do is analyze situations and not actually help. My motivation was really that I wanted to make this world into a better place. So I studied in Wageningen. That is now called International Land and Water Management, but which really is a very post-colonial, neo-colonial study, which was about irrigation in the former colonies of the Netherlands. At least that's also where the study originates. So I started doing that study, and it had a lot of very technical disciplines: hydraulics, mechanical engineering, and irrigation design, all of that. And already quite soon I realized, whoa, I don't like it, and I don't want it. So I went to my study advisor and I told him, this is not what I want to do. I don't see how learning all these very technical, the basics of all these very technical subjects will help me become the person that I would like to become. And then he said, Margreet, you know what? You can just study whatever you want. You take the minimum of technical courses, but stay with us, because I wanted to move to the social sciences. So in the end, that's what I did. That would not be possible anymore. But he just said, okay, you design your own study program. So I did development sociology, development economics, a bit of engineering, gender studies. I had fun when studying. I did a lot.
That was lucky. You had a great advice, and they made what you are today possible.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So let's start with the first thing about why is water political and not a
Yes.
technical question. And especially in India, water sits in civil and environmental engineering departments. Every government agency you go has assistant engineer, executive engineer, superintending engineer, chief engineer. So it's engineer, engineer, engineer. And so our institutions are only peopled by people who have engineering expertise. And yet, water, as you've argued in all of your career, is a series of political choices. It's not even bureaucratic, it's not even just like rulemaking. So, can you explain to us why water is political at all?
So I'm not arguing that water is not technical. It's also technical. But what I'm arguing is that every technical choice or every intervention in water also is a political intervention. It always entails a political choice. Almost always, a water intervention has implications for how water itself is distributed, how water control is regulated or arranged, how risks are distributed. So always it entails questions about who gets access to water, which places will receive water, who is protected from flood risks and who isn't. Inevitably, all interventions entail those kind of questions, which are at heart political questions. They cannot be solved by any technical formula. And of course, the engineers like to believe that what they do is not political at all. And they like to believe that what they're doing is science, and science is supposed to be not political. So that there is a tension there.
There is this idea of the normative and the descriptive, which is where science is descriptive, but then there's a normative component to any design. And this becomes even more important in the world we are, because you're seeing people who say, politics is too messy. Let's get an AI overlord that will
Yeah. Yeah.
that will make all our decisions, right? In a couple of your papers, where I saw one of your studies on South Africa, for example, where they designed irrigation institutions, but the way you design the institution ends up determining who gets water for what. Can you explain to us with an example of how an engineering design project designed one way has one set of outcomes, but another way has another set, and both are equally valid from a technical perspective, but they have completely different political outcomes in terms of the winners and losers?
The example that pops up in my head is the classical example of how irrigation projects used to be designed in the 1970s and 80s, which were the big resettlement schemes. And these big resettlement schemes, they were designed with the assumption that farm families consisted of one male farmer, his wife, who would assist him on the farm, and a couple of children. So the resettlement schemes, what they did, they redesigned entire large stretches of land, and then this land had to be reallocated. The
In
criteria.
which country was
This
this?
was in many countries,
In many global south countries.
including Sri Lanka, but also the Gambia, Cameroon. All these resettlement schemes had the same logic, basically. So when the land was reallocated, the criteria for obtaining irrigated plot were, oh, you had to be a farmer, you had to have a family with laborers who could assist you on the farm. So automatically, all that land was assigned, or the people who would get access to that land were automatically men. In many countries, that went against or conflicted with how farming used to be organized. In many countries, it was not just men who used to have land rights, or there was complex systems of land and water rights where men and women would sometimes collaborate and sometimes do things on their own account. These settlement schemes completely disrupted that, with the effect that the schemes did not yield the results that were anticipated. In some cases,
In fact, worsened in some cases.
yes, worsened. Food security worsened. In many cases, women who were expected to work on the plots of their husbands, they refused to do that because they were not sure of benefiting from the fruits of their labor. So they decided to then work on plots outside of the scheme, or they decided to work on the plots of their neighbors where at least they would get a wage. Some very fundamental, I would say, design errors, not realizing, not taking into account how farming is organized and how labor is organized, how the fruits of labor are rewarded in irrigated farming.
So these were resettlement schemes from big dams. So at the dam itself, firstly, is a reallocation, essentially. There's one group of people who were living life happily along the river and growing stuff. And then somebody says, well, that's not efficient. A lot of this water is going to the ocean so that we can have a bunch of people now that can get 2 crops or 3 crops. But
Yes.
then the people who get the 2 and 3 crops are not the same people as the people who were whose land went under the dam. So you set up the resettlement scheme. A Nobel laureate economist, I remember Ken Arrow, was sitting in, I forget who was the speaker. I think it was Sanjeev Kagram, who wrote about
Hmm.
dams and development.
Yes.
And he asked him, well, if dams have such a high multiplier effect, why can't you take that money and make people who have lost their land rich beyond their wildest dreams?
Yes.
If they
Yes.
really have a
Yeah.
multiplier effect, which
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
valid question.
Yes.
And what you're saying is one reason is that we don't know how to actually redistribute, although that part of it may be outside the irrigation engineers, maybe remit. But the fact is, a lot of these are run by engineers and they don't understand how society is organized.
Yes.
And therefore, they
Yes.
don't understand the implications of very simplistic definitions of how you set up
Yeah.
resettlement.
Yeah.
But can you tell us a little bit about water institutions in the dam projects itself and canal command areas itself and how
Yeah.
those are organized? Because that's purely within the remit of the irrigation department. And how are ways in which those go wrong as well?
When I started my career in the 1980s, there was a lot of talk about irrigation management. My first job was at what was still called the Irrigation Management Institute. It's now called the Water Management Institute.
International Water Management Institute, which was then IWR.
Yes. And so there was a lot of talk about irrigation management, and that was a bit of a revolution because until then, everybody thought irrigation is about engineering and not about management. And at first, it was quite hopeful, I would say. It was hopeful because there was a whole movement also among a group of social scientists concerned about water who said, well, let's empower irrigators and farmers and make sure that they can decide about their own water distribution and let so that they can collaborate with uh, the government irrigation department and the engineers, but basically farmers decide when they want water, how much of it they want, and how they want to distribute it, how they want to organize maintenance, etc. And often lessons were taken also from farmer managed irrigation systems. So social scientists went into systems that were built and organized by farmers to see, hey, how do farmers do it and what can we learn from those? I would say was hopeful and positive. Then came the 1980s, 1990s, and this whole idea of farmer participation got an entirely different meaning because then the waves of neoliberalism came, and the main logic of farmer participation actually became a very different one. It was governments wanting to save on the costs of managing irrigation systems and operating them. So the involvement of farmers was a way to shed responsibilities and costs of operating and maintaining irrigation systems to farmers. So I think that is important to take into account if you look at to how this is done. And then also the question of participation becomes a very different one, because then it's not only about taking your irrigation faith in your own hands and farmers organizing their own irrigation, but it's also them suddenly becoming responsible for very costly operation and maintenance and also repairs of the systems that were built by the government. And then you can see the question of participation becomes a very different one.
And this has an implication, because if your interpretation of we really want to hear from farmers and about how they should manage their systems becomes farmer participation means farmers pay for themselves, only the people who are most able to pay are able to survive a system, because they are able to build preferentially pipelines to themselves, or the richest groups kind of figure it out. So you get essentially the economic or neoliberal logic of farmer management systems didn't become let farmers organize so that we can hear from them about how to release the water, but it really became the rich get the water,
Yeah,
essentially, or
that's
the most
yeah.
powerful get the water.
Yeah, and often these programs also went accompanied with quite radical land and water titling programs. I don't know so much in India. In India, it's a bit different, but especially in Latin American countries, starting with Chile, but then also in Peru. And the idea behind this was that, well, once the water is titled, people can sell their water titles. And if they sell it, then there is an incentive. So there's a market logic behind it. Then there's an incentive for them to use it as productively as possible. And of course, you can imagine what that leads to. The poorest people become forced to sell their land and water rights to those who can afford to pay for it. So another way in which these neoliberal programs create inequities and further inequities in terms of water.
So I'm going to just add one thing here, because I think for a lot of people listening, they'd be like, that doesn't sound so bad, because at least they were getting paid and it was voluntary. They chose to do it. Um, but I think one of the problems that we've always had is, if you take people who the only skill they have is tilling the land, that's the only thing they know how to do, and suddenly you give them $1 million, um, they don't know how to manage money. Actually, they don't know how to make money out of money. That's not a skill set. So they drink a lot and buy a few very expensive cars often, and then often that goes away, because you've taken away the only way of life they know and given them this other thing that they're not children of financiers, so they don't know how to invest in the stock market and make it come, and then invest in education, and then they don't know how to do those things. I mean, otherwise people are like, what's wrong? You're giving people money, they are richer than they've ever been, what's wrong with that?
Yes, you're right. But there's, of course, stories attached to this. These are already poor people. They often have small plots of land, they have a little bit of water, and they can make do. But of course, in many cases, you say they are not trained to deal with large amount of money, which is probably true. What is also true is that they are often forced to sell land and water because they are indebted, and the indebtedness comes from, well, in India it would be sugarcane, I guess. That farmers like sugarcane because they say it's an easy crop, it's a reliable crop. Many smallholder farmers have big debts with sugar factories. So if they are not able to pay back these debts, then in the end they are forced to sell their land and water, and they end up with very little money. So the only thing they can do then is sell their labor. You could say it's a classical primitive accumulation by dispossession story, a Marxist story, where you sell your means of production and the only thing you have left to sell is your labor. Yeah.
And so they become in very weak negotiating positions, because you don't have, it's not even skilled labor, it's really farm labor at that point. Also, in those negotiations, whether they are in debt or any or otherwise, they are not skilled negotiators when it comes to money. I mean, they don't know necessarily what the value is. So there's an asymmetry of information in
Yes,
many of those
probably.
transactions. So you're giving
Probably.
away something which has sustained you and your family and your community, undervaluing it because you just don't know how to monetize or quantify that.
Yeah, there's different ways of telling that story, but this is also one way. Yes.
I mean, the reason I'm speaking in economic terms, I know that you use the Marxist language, but I think the thing is that people come from different disciplines, and you want to be able for people to see it from whatever vantage point they're standing, right? And if you come from an economics business background, then you're seeing it as farmers don't have negotiation abilities. If you're coming
Yeah,
from a
yeah.
Marxist background, you'd understand that they're giving away their means of production.
Yes,
But
yes.
really, basically, you're taking people who lived with dignity on their own land and essentially reducing them to having to sell their labor season to season. And
Yes.
that's the
Yeah.
net outcome of the way an entire design of a system was done. If you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to subscribe and explore more conversations on the channel. Share this episode with your colleagues, friends, or anyone interested in water and sustainability. And tell us about yourself in the comments. Are you a student, a professional, or just curious about water? Let us know where you're listening from and if you'd like to suggest a guest or topics for further episodes. I have one question for you, just as a follow up on your the International Irrigation Management Institute, because we always had social scientists studying farmer managed systems. But one of my big complaints has been we never had social scientists engineering systems. And I think this is a problem with both the way the engineering disciplines see social scientists, but also how social scientists see themselves. So, social scientists often see themselves as being good at critiquing, but not necessarily good at designing institutions. So, how does that get fixed? Or when you went, to start off farmer managed systems, were there people in the irrigation department with the skills to understand the social societies, or was it really just engineers thinking of this as a technical thing, and so there was never any hope right from the beginning? Or did they at least try to have whatever, I don't even know what the title of that job would be, outreach coordinator, I don't know.
I think there were many who tried to design institutions, right? And many followed the fabulous work of Eleanor Ostrom in doing this. She translated her insightful work on how the commons work, which was a lot of it, which was based on the study of farmer managed irrigation systems in Nepal. So she came up with design principles, and these were adopted by many to design irrigation institutions. Now the question is, and I think that would be a question that is as valid for technical design as for social design, is how do you do design? Because also with technical design, but in the same with social design, you start with something, but once a system gets used, and once people start using whether a social institution or a technical infrastructure, it changes, right? It becomes something else altogether, because people use it, because of the force of water itself, because they may expand the command area of an irrigation system, they may redesign the rules of an institution. And I think it's that learning from that, both in the social design and in the infrastructural design, means that maybe we need to rethink what design is about. Maybe it's not you sit behind your computer or behind your drawing board and you have your optimal ideal picture, and you have done all your calculations, and you know that if you do it this way, it will yield optimal results. But maybe design should be thought more of as a in terms of experimenting. You start with something and then you allow it to grow, to change, to become something else. And you have experts who facilitate or guide that process.
That I think makes sense, because if you think about where the hydroeconomic literature was in the 80s with the Harvard Water Program and so on, was all about optimization. You create these optimal irrigation systems with optimal cropping patterns. And if you see sort of the evolution of what used to be hydroeconomics in the 1980s and then to sociohydrology became more about co-evolutionary kind of thinking, saying you do what you think you do, but then people do what they want to do, and the system actually evolves in unexpected directions. And what you're basically saying is that you will never be able to anticipate every single component of how humans are going to respond and adapt
Hmm.
once things get laid on the ground. And what you need is sort of spaces and processes and mechanisms to facilitate a constant adjustment,
Yeah,
so that it's,
yeah,
the system stays on track and the original intent of being just and sustainable continues. Is that what you're
yeah. And maybe even the original intent itself will change, right?
right?
You would hope that there is a kind of learning among all involved. And in practice, that often happens, of course.
I think it happens a little more in the Netherlands than it does in the global south, because I saw one of your papers on what is the Dutch model of water. And you argue that the Dutch model of water is this idea of participation at the intersection of sort of design and engineering of systems, and maybe that lends itself to this kind of thing. But I'm not sure, in irrigation systems in India, there's irrigation engineers sitting with the community saying, let's map where the canals are now that you guys are doing it, and let's see what's the better way to govern it, and that's more just now that it's this way.
Maybe not formally, Veena, but in practice, I mean, I'm now reminded of the study that Aquadam and Sopacom did in Ravangan in Maharashtra, where the a canal irrigation system completely changed because people started putting in borewells in the command area. So instead of a canal system where water was distributed through ever smaller canals and led to floods, what happened is that the main canal was mainly used to recharge the groundwater.
Right.
And the engineer knew this, and the whole system adjusted. Formally, no.
That I meant formally, yes. They may say, okay, they may shrug themselves and saying it, don't fix not what's not broken. So they might understand that this conjunctive use has evolved, but they're not like changing rules on paper. But in the Netherlands, I think they have a little more of that formal mechanism to kind of look at what's on the ground, and or do
Maybe.
be
Yeah,
maybe.
maybe. I don't know so much about the Netherlands, so my plea is also to learn more from what is happening in practice. The formal rules are important, but if you look at how, because water is also capricious, right? It flows and it's very difficult to actually control. So learning from how people navigate these capricious waters in practice and seeing how they actually do it, both engineers and farmers, I think that is important.
But if that is turning out to be dispossessing certain groups or it's inequitable, you do need then intervention to rebalance, right? So let's just step back a little bit to this idea of sort of what is measured. I mean, you've done a lot of work on looking at indices, and basically with this idea of engineers are either trying to optimize for something or the other. They're optimizing irrigation efficiency in the canal system or one of these things. And what you've shown over and over again is one of the problems that we struggle with this is because we are often not picking the right index to start with, or you're picking
Yeah,
something that's very narrow. So can you tell us
yeah,
a little bit about how do engineers kind of measure water
yeah.
systems, and then what are all the ways in which that
Uh,
evolves or doesn't work out?
uh, I think since I have engaged with engineers, they always have this obsession almost with efficiency and with measuring performance, right? And this is indeed an obsession with optimization. And I think it's also an obsession with control. Yeah, there's a lot to say about this. Maybe it helps to give an example. because I don't think measuring and wanting to account for where water flows is wrong in itself. I do think it's very difficult. Again, because water is capricious and it often flows in unexpected directions and in weird ways, or it seeps in the ground, or it evaporates, or there's return flows, and we all know this. So that is one thing. It's difficult, and it's always very, so how it flows is also always very specific to a place. So it depends on geology, it depends on slopes, it depends on where the water comes from, etc. So it's very specific how people engage with it, how they use it. So that makes it very difficult to come with universal performance indicators or universal measurements of efficiency. And that is what many engineers like also. And I can understand also, because you want to be able to compare the performance of one system to that of another. That's basically the idea. When you want to be able to show, hey, this system performs well if you compare it to others. So I understand that, the logic of it, but I also see how it can be very dangerous, and I have so many examples. But one example is, we have in the Netherlands, we used to have this wonderful engineer who was very concerned with water problems in the world. His name is Arjen Hoekstra. I'm sure you know him.
Of course.
And he said, well, just like the environmental footprint, let's develop a water footprint. And he did this amazing work. And I love the work that he did to show that almost everything that we use uh, requires water. But people are not aware of how much water it takes to produce your jeans or to produce your hamburger or whatever. So he started doing these calculations to create a kind of water consciousness. And I think that is amazing. But at the same time, he also wanted to use his water footprint and his calculations to he wanted to take it back to farmers in a way, and use it to change the behavior of farmers, to make their irrigation behavior more efficient. And that's where I think things can easily go wrong. One of the examples that I wrote about is with Carolina Dominguez Guzman and others. Peru invited him, and Peru said, please, can you help us? Because we are being critiqued by environmental organizations in the UK, especially, saying, hey, you grow crops like asparagus on your desert coast, sucking the aquifers of Peru dry, just so that UK citizens can eat asparagus year round. So Peru wanted to improve its reputation, its water reputation, and they invited Arjen Hoekstra to help them. What they did was say, okay, let's give farmers a certificate if they use water wisely on their farms. Now, this is where the problems start, because how do you know if a farmer uses water wisely? Especially with smallholder farmers, it's impossible, very costly, but also very difficult to precisely know how each individual smallholder farmer uses water on their plots, right? You cannot measure it unless water is contained in
Pipes.
pipes and you meter it. But most smallholder farmers, that is not the case. So what they did, they used a proxy indicator. The proxy indicator for water use, it was if farmers had a drip irrigation system on their fields, it meant wise water use. So there, well, I can say much more about it, but of course, having a drip system in your field, it may mean that you use less drop per whatever crop you use in the plot, but it doesn't say anything about the wisdom of water use at the watershed level. And there is more to say about this, because the drip systems that most Peruvian farmers use are produced by Netafim, an Israeli drip company. Netafim used to be a small family-based, kibbutz-based company. But it went to the market, it started selling shares, which meant that it became important for Netafim to sell more and more systems. And one way of doing this is over designing. So a friend of mine and colleague in Wageningen studied this a little bit, and he said, well, the engineers working for Netafim are actually rewarded on the basis of how many drip systems they sell. Naya, etc. So you can feel, there's all that here. This is where the indices and the measurements can go completely wrong. And at the same time, what some smallholder farmers, like the ones that Carolina studied, who have been growing, this was about mangoes, not asparagus, because asparagus is not grown by smallholders, but mangoes are. And what she showed is these smallholders, they have farmed on the desert coast of Peru for generations. So they know how to navigate with little water, with drought. They have developed all kinds of ways of using water wisely. But suddenly, if drip irrigation becomes the proxy indicator of wise water use, then everything else what farmers do automatically is discarded as inefficient, as backward, as not wise. So there's also a risk that this water wisdom then gets eroded or discarded or dismissed and lost. So that is just one example of how indices can get dangerous. I can give many more, but yeah.
I remember listening to this case study. I attended your class. I was guest lecturer in your class in 2019 when you presented this case in class. One other thing that you said, which is that often the smallholder farmers in that case were not just growing one crop, they were growing multiple crops, one in the shade of the other. And then they were, they had a fish pond, but then that was being used for something else. And so the problem is that the simple indices were lending themselves to monocrops, essentially monocrops with water delivered in pipes, while when you might have had much less water, but you have 17 different types of things being grown in the same farm. You don't have a way to measure a rupees per meter cube, because the return flow of one thing is going, and the pigs are there and they're eating on the waste of something, and so there's no way to arrive at a rupees per meter cubed. And so a much wiser system is actually dismissed in favor of, and for all a lot of the drip systems in India are all plastic based, and there's microplastic and all of those issues additionally.
You're right. So it's simply the wrong way of measuring efficiency for these farmers. And these farmers would allow their mango trees to grow tall. If you monocrop mango trees with drip, you are advised to keep them rather small and have them in rows, because that's more efficient. There's all kinds of reasons for it. But the smallholders would allow their trees to grow tall. And of course, if they grow tall, they also grow big root systems. By having big root systems, they can get water from much deeper, but they can also get nutrients from the soil from much deeper, which means that they need less fertilizer. Well, you see, there's all kinds of ramifications that indeed focusing on a single crop, monocropping optimization logic.
And if you've seen the data on all of this, we see over and over again that sort of efficiency and resilience are either they can be straight up negative, but at least they are orthogonal in the sense that but sometimes they are direct trade-offs where you improve efficiency but you become less resilient because you've kind of optimized on too much in one direction, and then when you get a shock in a different direction, you collapse.
Yeah.
So that's a problem with us, and of course engineers we love to design and then have three very simple matrices, but I think we struggle as humans, and maybe that's the entire, the whole neoliberal logic is to optimize along a handful of directions. We struggle with complexity. We don't know how to manage complexity, even though intuitively you can see that's better, but we don't have simple ways of saying why that's better. Do you have our episodes running in the background? If you're curious about a technical term that we've used, or an acronym we've forgotten to expand, we have on-screen explanations that we offer on video. You talked about the women's story in the beginning, and a
Yes,
lot of your work has been around gender and the intersection of gender and water, and you've
yes,
coined terms like hydropatriarchy
yeah,
and understanding why not having women in decision making has been a big problem because all of your irrigation engineers have traditionally been men. Um, Interestingly, I think in a lot of the global south, you're seeing more and more irrigation
yes,
engineers
sir.
because
Yeah,
irrigation engineering has become less desirable
yes,
compared to
yes,
AI and tech and so on and
yeah,
so forth.
yeah.
And I wonder if that will change anything. It'll be interesting to see if that has unintended positive consequences. And you gave us an example to start with, which is the definition of a household as being a male head with a wife as a helpmeet and then some children, which was not the traditional society in that place, and that dispossessed women suddenly. But why is it that engineering design matters, and how does it make women's lives harder?
Yeah, there's many layers to that question. So maybe let me start just by saying why it is dangerous for any profession, but also for irrigation engineer, to just be done by a particular group of people. And in terms of irrigation engineering, it's mostly men, and it's also men of a particular class or group. It's not just all men. Jan Willem Lieberand, whom I supervised, he was a PhD student. He studied the masculinity of irrigation engineering in Nepal, and he also showed how it is also linked to caste, and there's a hierarchy of engineers and etc. But why is it dangerous? Is because if engineering comes to be associated with a particular group of people, with men in this case, then the profession tends to become very rigid because there is a mutual naturalization. You are a good engineer if you display characteristics that are also seen as belonging to real men. So, real men are real engineers and vice versa. That makes it very difficult for that profession to learn and to change because it becomes naturalized. So that is one, I think, important aspect of it. It's also important that the profession then becomes very inhospitable to others, men who don't conform to this particular ideal of engineering masculinity, of which there are many. It's not all men, or women, or people from different castes. It comes with a kind of rigidity that I think is dangerous. It prevents learning. It prevents, if I use the word that you used earlier, it prevents a kind of resilience. Also, it makes the profession very,
Narrow minded and some way conservative.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that is one aspect.
So if you look at engineers, they might shrug and say, "So what? What's wrong with that? It's maybe why are you bringing uh, all of this feminist stuff into engineering? Engineering is equations and models, and where does justice or any of that come into it?"
Yeah, yeah. These you, you by asking that question, you remind me of the first period of my work at the International Water Management Institute, because I was hired to start a women and irrigation program, and these were precisely the questions that my colleagues would ask me. Why does it matter? We are about making sure that water gets to the right place in the right moment in the right quantities, etc. That has nothing to do with gender or with social questions.
Maybe one example is what's happened with the multiple use. They traditionally thought water can only go to big farms and not to like nutrition gardens or I'm just giving an example of.
That's a good example. I mean, I remember when I did research in Sri Lanka, where indeed many of my colleagues with the irrigation engineers, they wanted to calculate the performance of irrigation systems. But to do that, you need to precisely know what the command area of an irrigation system is, right? And they would always take the original command area, which I thought was very funny because that was never the
The actual
area
command.
actual irrigated. That was one thing, but then indeed many women farmers in the schemes that we studied, they would use a bit of the water, yes, to wash clothes, for drinking cattle, but also to irrigate their home gardens and their homestead gardens, which were very important for food security, for feeding the families.
And nutritional security, that's where they got
Yeah,
all their
yeah,
vitamins and all from. Yeah.
yes. But the engineers insisted that that water that women diverted to their homesteads was water lost. So it counted against the performance of the irrigation system as a whole. So you're very right. Yeah.
Is it just the rigidity of the profession which has over time gotten so, crusted that they can only see the traditional command area? Like, why is it that there was a lack of saying, oh, we didn't even think of those nutrition gardens? How cool is that? Let's count that and let's count all of the benefits of that, because that is the benefit of the larger engineering. It's a legitimate benefit. Why is it that that could not be the reaction, instead of that is outside the command area? You guys are illegally tapping the water. Never
Yeah.
mind,
Yeah.
it has these mega multiplier
Yeah.
benefits for society,
Yes.
but
Yeah, I
that's
don't
wrong.
know. Your guess is as good as mine, Vina. I really, I'm not. There is part of it is the rigidity. There was something also about going back to the original design, right? And wanting that to be.
You've fallen in love with your design, so you're like, we already made it perfect. You can't make it more perfect than it was.
But of course, I also don't know because this was so long ago. It might well be that it has now completely changed, and that now there's much more acceptance for indeed the multiple use systems, and so I hope that is the case. Yeah.
But I think the much more acceptance of multiple use systems came sort of with all of the bringing of gender dimensions into irrigation, and then the importance of what the components of productive water in rural landscapes by women, and then the design of systems for multiple use. So in a sense, that was a natural evolution of the discourse as well. So now we've had sort of 20, 30 years of thinking about this, and we've sort of had this evolution. So where we said, this very narrow way of looking at command areas, and then the evolution of multiple use, and this idea of, not everything looks like a big irrigated field. Some things are water for cattle, water for, homestead gardens, so on and so forth. Today, if you had to think about where there is still blind spots, where would you say is those are today? Is it like in representation, formal representation in irrigation committees?
It also depends on where you are, but I think one blind spot perhaps is in water quality.
Mhm.
One PhD student that I worked with, Irene Leonardelli, she studied a small system in Ponde, Maharashtra, that uses largely untreated wastewater from Pune that is diverted to the area. A lot of the men in that village, they work outside of the village, so it's mostly women farmers who use the water, and of course for them it was amazing. Suddenly they could grow much more and they had this access to water, but it was dirty water. So it suddenly also meant that they had to develop all kinds of skills to learn to distinguish between different qualities of water and manage these water qualities, because the dirty water would seep into the aquifer, the same aquifer that was also the source of their drinking water. So it came with a lot of additional tasks that often go unnoticed because it's women doing it, and they do it as part of their domestic duties. So people hardly notice it,
Hmm.
but it's a lot of work and it comes with a lot of skills too, and the skills to distinguish between different qualities of water. So I think that might be one big blind spot.
I think I just want to say that earlier, the multiple use, we said it as if that's become embedded everywhere. But, the irrigation systems in India that we work in Raichur and so on, It's still only men in the what user committees, and the homesteads are not spread throughout the landscape. So you have the village and the nutrition gardens, and then the farms are far away. So the irrigation water is still only going to the farms. And India's the drinking water scheme which comes to the village is still 55 liters per capita per day. There is water for livestock, but there's no water for nutrition gardens as a recognized thing. So although we said as if it's been solved everywhere, but it's not.
Yeah, and of course the other thing that is happening is that with not just neoliberalism, you have written about this also. There was at least some public control of irrigation water in canal irrigation systems, with farmers increasingly using wells to get water. That control is no longer there. So that also requires an entirely different way of thinking about how water can be managed. If one still wants to consider irrigation water a public service, which not everyone agrees to, then the question is, how do you actually manage this public service when it's so difficult to control wells and pumping of groundwater? And it's not directly related to gender, but it is related to how water is distributed and controlled, which is always also gendered, of course. Yeah.
It could be gender, but it could also be just class and
Yes.
caste,
Yes.
because borewell ownership is certainly correlated with class and caste, even if gender is not. And so that's the other kind of inclusion that you've also studied in a lot of your work. If you find this episode to be valuable, please like the video and check out our other show on this channel, The Well Labs Show. And don't forget to subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel. So you've kind of talked about the way we design systems and who gets to be part of the decision making, but even beyond the actual decision making, beyond the ideation itself, who's seen as people with legitimate ideas on how to design, and then of course who's included, and then who's part of the governance, really determines who gets the water and then ultimately who prospers in society. And this can be men versus women, upper caste versus lower caste, rich people versus poor people, large landowners versus small holders. But increasingly, what we are seeing is there's also straight up sort of water grabbing by big corporations, so on and so forth. And you've kind of documented this other process, and it's almost extra legal, or it's almost outside the bureaucratic process. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing across the world on that?
Well, ironically, it's often not extra legal, Veena. Ironically, sometimes it's very legal. It's very legal. It's precisely what governments want. And the water titling programs I talked about earlier are actually designed to to make water accessible to the highest bidder. There are countries like Peru, Ethiopia, Kenya, where land is opened up for foreign investors or for national investors, but that, of course, land without water in arid and semi-arid places is worth very little. So it's not just land, but also water. I mean, the most extreme examples are actually there's big Dutch flower farms, for instance, in Ethiopia or in Kenya. Yeah, very ironically, I find sometimes with the help of Dutch Development Corporation money, that these investors go to a place like Kenya or Ethiopia and are assisted to build their farms. And these farms, they need a lot of water. So the water will have to come from somewhere. So it will mean that the the people who used to use that water can no longer use it. Some people call it a legally condoned form of theft because it is legal.
But you're saying that the people, because it's a common pool resource, these are the people who can, because they're getting the money, can put the deepest wells and suck the water out from under everybody else, right?
Yeah, but they can even have the formal water rights also.
How do you have formal water rights in an aquifer? Oh, but you're saying sometimes it happens from the dam. They give
Yes, yes.
preferential allocation from dams. So in India, it's very interesting, right? Because the highest priority is given to quote unquote drinking water, but drinking water is really water to cities. It's not, they don't distinguish saying this is bath water. But cities also have hotels with swimming pools. So the water going to the city, which has the highest priority, includes drinking water for everybody, but also commercial IT parks, all of that. And then agriculture comes below that. So a city like Bangalore, where we are, will always get the first call on the river Kaveri. So as the reservoir dries,
Hmm.
Bangalore never loses its water. The
Hmm.
farmers always do, but Bangalore will never lose its water because its water right is sitting on top of everything else. But they don't say we'll cut off the water to IT parks for that month, and let them. Bangalore gets its entire allocation, even in a drought. And that's one way in which you do it, by saying preferential allocation to, special economic zones, so on and so forth. Are there less legal ways that it's happening also?
I mean, I always like the old concept of hydraulic property that Walt Coward coined. And I think that is still a very relevant and valid concept, which is basically water itself is nothing unless you can access it. So unless you have the infrastructure and the technology to access and distribute it. So the idea of hydraulic property by Walt Coward says that those who invest in the infrastructure to access and distribute water are the ones who de facto own the water. And I think that is a rule that can be a non-legal way of water grabbing.
That's all of India's borewells then. All,
Exactly,
that's
exactly.
80% of our irrigation.
Yes, yes, and of course, the similar thing in a different way happens with dams. Those who invest in dams, and it used to be mostly public investment, but it no longer is. So those who invest in dams then control the water.
Even if the investment is public, there is lobbying by contractors. You see, if you look carefully at the dam data in India, sometimes you see really funny things. Like in some dams, suddenly the evaporation would have gone up 3x, at some point. And you're like, okay, it didn't get global warming's a problem, but not enough to increase. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's really just hiding
Yeah.
illegal allocations to certain interests in the evaporation number, because you can't call it out officially, but you've done it under the table. I've heard a lot of engineers, say, use the argument saying, well, the engineers did the design right, but society kind of was wrong in there were corrupt bad people. And I think the argument that there's no such thing as engineers got it right if they didn't understand fully how society is organized and kind of did it in a way that adapts to it and accounts for it, is kind
Hmm.
of the core argument I think you've had.
Engineers are part of society, right? That's another way of saying it. They're not outside of it. You can imagine your utopian ideal design, but that doesn't mean anything. You're part of a society, and so you're designing with and in a society, and every design is full of societal choices.
Margaret, if I asked you, let's say we made you in charge of a massive irrigation project.
Please don't, please don't, please don't.
You're like, that sounds like a nightmare. No, I'm asking this because it's important. I'll tell you why. Because there is a problem of self selection into some of these disciplines. If you already have a certain worldview, then you are more likely to become a business person or an engineer or a criminal mafia boss or whatever else, right? Because in a sense, the choices we make in our profession reflects our values in some way. And engineers often are people that believe very deeply in efficiency and rational thought and so on and so forth, and therefore they join certain professions because they feel it reflects that. But I think what we really need is people with different mindsets and value systems coming in. And the problem is, I feel a lot of social scientists self select
Yes,
out
that's
of
true.
these
That's true.
departments.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
how do we fix it if there is nobody who's a social scientist who's willing? And I understand is you have to tolerate the engineers and they will not give you respect and they don't even have space for you. But let's say we could create a department. Let's say you and I were able to create a water department. What's our ask for social scientists and for engineers? How would we do that?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would not hire myself. I think I'm not a very I'm not a very practical person. But I think, especially in India, Veena, and you know much better than I do, there's so many also engineers who do the most amazing work. Maybe they don't work for the bureaucracy, yeah, but there's many who have chosen also to work for NGOs and who spend their lives working with communities, trying to see how water can be cared for and dealt with in much more sustainable ways and distributed much more equally. So I think there's so much to learn from those initiatives, from people who actually work with communities, with people. They also bring in their engineering expertise. It's not that engineering is wrong per se. And I'm also not against engineers.
No, neither am I. And I'm just trying to figure out how to bring it in so that we are able to create that. I met a lot of irrigation engineers who've come from the space that you said, right? Even at the lowest levels of bureaucracy, saying all I wanted was to bring water to my village,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
so they
Yeah.
come with a lot of very pure goals. They are the ones who are also frustrated because they're not able to navigate the contractor nexus, the fact that the politician is bullying them to do something which is wrong, and so on. In a sense, you need engineers to have the life skills to be able to deal with humans, and then you need social scientists who are able to kind of embed into these departments and act as that interface, and the caring for water part of it, right? And I don't know how we will get to a bureaucratic or agency design which has that.
I also don't know because attempts have been made, right? Some 20 years ago, there was this. Also, of course, it was on the wave of neoliberalism, but it was also a genuine call to include more social science in irrigation bureaucracies. But I don't think that has had a lot of effect in changing the culture of the bureaucracy. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's very slow, two steps forward, one step back.
Yeah, but at the same time, I also think there is something interesting happening. Is that, as you say, and as I also see, there are many engineers who do, even those who work in the bureaucracy, who carve out their spaces to do wonderful work, but they never get rewarded or recognized for that work. They do it, but they almost have to hide it because that's not what they are appreciated for.
But I think what you're saying is maybe some of our role as sort of academics in civil society is to find those champions who are trying to
Yes,
do all of
yes,
this work
yeah.
with, listen deeply to their stakeholders, try to do, and then figure out if we can valorize and
Yes.
evangelize
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I want to end with a question on sort of the new water imaginary. And you've done
Yeah.
this through several of your newer projects. You're not always in the academic ivory tower. And one of
Hmm.
the reasons I enjoyed being in the Netherlands, both with Utrecht, but also the few times I visited IHE Delft, was these are institutions that are really trying to open up the ivory tower and work in a very integrated way with society. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects where you've actually done academic work, but it's really a process of co-creation with many different types of stakeholders?
Yeah. Yeah. I started doing this Vina precisely because I became a bit tired of always being the critical social scientist whose role is to expose evil, and to say, okay, this is where things go wrong. This is where you can find identify capitalism, and this is where you can identify patriarchy in water. And I've done a lot of that. I think it's important. It needs to be done, and people need to continue doing it. But I was getting a bit tired of it because I thought, yes, I'm only critiquing, and then what? So I thought, what else can we do? And then I realized there are people and also organizations. I think my biggest heroes there is Sopacom in Maharashtra, with whom I've worked for a long time. And I just I just admire them so much for the work they do in always trying to carve out spaces to do water otherwise, in ways that are more gender friendly, in ways that are more just, in ways that are less conflictual. And there are organizations and individuals like that in many countries. Sometimes they know each other. Sometimes Sopocom interacts with similar organizations, but often also they remain rather isolated. They work in their own places. And I thought, what if we can find ways of connecting similar kinds of organizations working in water, and so that they can learn from each other, and also that we as scholars, academics, can amplify their experiences and uh, tell the world, hey, there are other ways of engaging, navigating, doing water are possible. So that's a bit what I'm trying to do. And of course, some of my critical social science friends are skeptical. They say, Margreet, these are small initiatives. They can never be scaled up. They will always be demolished and crushed by capitalism. And don't get your hopes up. And maybe they're right. I don't know. But I think if we don't try, then it will never happen.
Well, then
And
we won't even have the few examples. So,
yes, yes.
at least you want to have a few examples.
Yeah, and I'm very much inspired by some prominent feminist scholars who do this work on care repair. There is this idea of transformation that happens in the form of a revolution, a big rupture. Something collapses and then something new emerges. And they say, well, but actually, maybe transformation happens through small steps and with people, and many of them are women who just do things differently, who just through their everyday activities try to build a different world, and documenting that, recognizing that, and amplifying that, I think is important. Yeah. Also because indeed we need different stories, right? We need different imaginations of how water can be done. So we need to tell them.
So, what's this new water imaginary that you can articulate to inspire the next generation of listeners that listening in?
It starts with something very simple, which is engineers would call it demand management. But I think it's simply adapting, adjusting uses of water to what is available. So it's nothing new. It has been there for a long time, but
Grow rice in wet places and not in Punjab, for example.
yeah. But still, most efforts of engineers are very much supply driven, and it's wastewater treatment, it's desal, it's more dams, and the other one is it's an acceptance that water will never can never be fully controlled. So maybe letting go of the ambition to control. I think there's so much investment in ever better models, ever better data, ever better measurements. And I think the idea behind it is that once we can map and measure all waters, we can also manage it. And I think that is an illusion. There's no direct causal relation between measurement and management. But I also think that all this investment in measurement is not all of it is wasted, because I think measurements can be very useful. But I think there maybe we could instead invest a bit more in just staying with the trouble, staying with the complexity of difficult waters. And that means that we become less global, less universal, less ambitious, and more grounded, more specific, more anchored in specific watery places, experimenting with how to best manage it in these places. And there I think a lot can be learned from what communities have already done, sometimes with the help of NGOs or even government organizations. I think you are doing a lot of that work, Veena. You're an example to me. I mean, as someone who truly understands that doing water well means being grounded in a place, being very attuned to the specificities of the place in which water is done.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. I wonder sometimes whether the world in which we are living, you're moving away from network television based, determining the debate to virality and people kind of, being able to make little TikTok videos. You're moving away from data being all centralized to citizen data becoming more easy to share and collect. I'm wondering whether this can be the kernel of that bottom up way of thinking as well.
Yeah, I think so. It could be an important kernel indeed. But there is also a lot of pressure or appeal, at least maybe only if you're in the academic world. You get a lot of reward for making global statements, right? For pretending to be as generic, as universal as possible. And I think, oh yeah, maybe we should in the academic world we should start to cherish again the local stories, and not just the local stories from the Netherlands, because there's another set of deep hierarchies and inequities there. That if a story comes from the Netherlands, it's seen as a story that can travel and that embodies a generic truth. If it comes from Ghana or from Colombia, it's often seen as
It's a case study.
it's a case study, it's local. So
Yes.
there's things to be remedied there too.
But I really think that, even with the rise of LLMs and AI and so on, our ability to find patterns and across stories from everywhere instead of kind of this thing, it's possible that we will be able to do things that we can't do right now. But I mean, only because we have to end on a hopeful note, because can you leave us with some inspiration for younger people? If you were starting your career again, what would you be excited about the next 30 years?
I call it tapping into the undercurrent. But so what I'm excited about and what gives me hope is that if you don't listen to the big stories of war, of right wing populism, but instead, if I just look in Delft, in my own street, or in my own municipality, how much people do to help each other, how much they do in terms of volunteer work. I mean, it's just amazing. Why don't we amplify and see those stories? Why don't we tell those stories more? Because I think there's a lot there. There's a lot that can also be celebrated and told, and needs to be celebrated and told, because there's hope there. And not all of this voluntary help work I would want to celebrate. But I think, oh, there's amazing agroecology initiatives. There's amazing local food initiatives. There's so many interesting things happening that I think, oh, let's share those. Let's tell them. Many people are inspired by them. And yeah, so that is my hope. The undercurrent, I call it.
Fantastic. Margaret, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for doing this podcast with me. I've just enjoyed chatting with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much.
We will be linking a lot of your academic papers and so on to the podcast on the landing page of the episode. So even though we kept the conversation, we didn't reference all of your papers in the discussion, but they will be there for people to find.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
That's it for this episode of the Water Data Podcast. Thank you for listening till the end. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. You can also find the Water Data Podcast on all podcast platforms. Until then, stay curious and stay connected.